Welcome to the press conference on the launch of the latest APEC Economic Trends Analysis report. We have here today to talk about some of the key findings from the report Dr. Denis, who is the director of the APEC Policy Support Unit. The Policy Support Unit is the research and analysis arm of APEC as mandated by leaders, and is the author of the APEC Economic Trends Analysis. We will have about 7 to 8 minutes of remarks from Dr. Hu, and then afterwards we will open it up to question and answers from the audience. So with that, I turn it over to Dr. Hu.
Thank you, David. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to highlight our most recent Economic Trends Analysis report. I'm the director of the Policy Support Unit at the APEC Secretariat, and we come out with these reports at least twice a year to give an update on the economic environment and outlook over the next 2 years. So let me share with you for the next couple of minutes some of the key highlights for this report. And this report itself will be uploaded on the APEC website, I think today. So if you see from this slide, the APEC economies have proven to be quite resilient in 2014 amid, as many of you know, some quite challenging external conditions. The region itself grew by 2.9% in 2014, vis-a-vis the global GDP growth of about 3.4%. And of course, this, as I mentioned, this is amidst uncertainties. We've seen the fall in oil prices, which have dropped by more than over 40-50% last year, as well as the timing of the monetary normalization in the US. As we know, QE has ended, and the big question, of course, is when the US and the Fed will raise interest rates this year. As part of this, we see in terms of the economic performance for the region, the industrialized economies of APEC have more or less moved in tandem with global GDP growth. But growth in APEC developing economies were a bit more divergent. Some were growing, ranging between 0.7% to 8%. In fact, some of the economies such as Japan and Brunei reported contractions last year for different reasons. In Japan's case, they were affected by the rise in the consumption tax that was introduced last year, whereas for Brunei, they were affected by the significant fall in oil prices. As you know, they're a major exporter of oil. In terms of the growth registered last year, the main driver of that growth was private consumption. And that remained to be one of the key contributors to the overall GDP growth. Private consumption expenditure contributed to about 2.6% of that regional growth. And that was also boosted by a combination of what we call easy monetary point, a low interest rate regime, and strong credit growth in many of the economies. Government spending itself was also relatively stable, and we find that growth, fixed capital formation, that's a combination of both private and public investments, played a supporting role. But net exports itself was rather volatile. We've seen, in terms of quarterly numbers last year, a pickup in the first quarter, and then sluggish growth in the second and third quarter, and then towards the third and fourth quarter, again, a pickup in terms of exports. And that again reflects basically the uncertainties in the economic environment. In terms of its trade performance, we see here that APEC trade has still pretty robust compared to the rest of the world. We find that in terms of export growth, it registered about 2% over the previous year. And over the last 5 years, since 2010, export growth has been on the positive territory. So as we mentioned, in terms of its trade performance, it still continues to, in many ways, to outperform the rest of the world. So moving forward in terms of the near-term outlook for 2015 and 2016, we find that economic growth will hinge on the strength of domestic demand, the impact of lower oil prices, and also the effect of this fragile U.S. economic recovery vis-a-vis China's growth moderation. As we know, growth is moderating to, according to the IMF, roughly between 6 to 7% over the next 2 years. In terms of economic performance of various APEC economies, we're going to continue to see quite divergent numbers over the next 2 years, and part of that will reflect the slowdown in terms of commodities demand, and as well as lower oil prices. At least 8 out of 21 economies in APEC are crude oil exporters, while the rest are net exporters. So you're going to see the benefits and costs reflected differently on these economies, hence manifested in terms of the divergent growth rates. Having said that, based on the most recent IMF forecast, we are looking at still a rather optimistic outlook over the next 2 years. The APEC region is expected to grow by 3.2% for 2015 and 2016. But there are still downside risks, as mentioned. Of course, one of the concerns is the direction of oil prices, whether they'll continue to remain relatively low. There's also the concerns of the U.S. recovery, to see how strong that U.S. recovery is, and of course China in terms of its slowdown, whether there's a moderate slowdown in its growth numbers, or is there going to be a hard landing over the next 2 years. And so that would have an impact on forecast numbers over the next 2 years, and we'll see at the next economic trends analysis report how the region will fare. So I'll just stop here and to open up for any questions or comments.
Thank you, Dennis. Thanks to you, Dr. Hu. So we'll open it up to questions now from the audience. Does anybody have a question for Dr. Hu on the economic outlook for the Philippines and for the Pacific Rim economies of APEC, or related issues? I think to get things started, I'll ask the first question. And you've given a somewhat optimistic forecast for economic growth and for trade in the next 2 years, 3.2% for next year, and in the following year, 2016. What is your take on the risk situation for economies around the Pacific Rim?
Well, as I mentioned, I think there are clearly some concerns and downside risks on the growth numbers. As I mentioned, there's a lot of that drivers of growth will depend on domestic demand, private consumption. So we need to see the direction of interest rates as well, whether interest rates will remain relatively low over the next 2 years. As I mentioned, this region is also dependent on trade. And the two largest engines of growth, the US, China, are having different challenges. I mean, one, of course, in the US case, a very fragile recovery since the global financial crisis in 2008. And of course, in China's case, a slowing down of its economy. And there's been a lot of discussions here in APEC on the need for strengthening that domestic demand, which also includes implementing structural reforms that would help the economies to sustain their growth, as well as promoting and supporting, say, small, medium enterprises as part of the inclusive growth agenda for this year.
Questions? Don't be shy. Tomorrow's the trade ministers meeting. You'll have the ministers responsible for trade from the 21 APEC member economies. These are economies that together account for almost half of global trade, half of trade for the entire world, 60% of total GDP, and much of the world's growth. So this is a good chance to talk about some of your questions about trade and economic growth going into the meeting. Okay, well, I'll take the chance to ask a second question. Today we heard from Trade and Industry Secretary Domingo from the Philippines. He spoke a bit about the agenda for tomorrow, for the next couple of days for the meeting. Oh, do we have a question? I'll save that. If you could please state your name and also your organization.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm Luella Desiderio from Philippine Star. I was just wondering if you could give a specific outlook for the Philippine market. Do you think that in terms of economic growth, can you give a forecast for this year and for next year, and what drivers? Thanks.
I think you'll find I don't have the numbers with me, but when you take the look at the economic trends analysis report, they have forecast numbers for the Philippines for 2015 and 2016. So I think I'll leave it as that. But as you know, the Philippines has been in a way one of the star performers in terms of economic growth over the last 2 years or so. And much of that is driven by domestic demand as well as a very strong services sector that you have here. So take a look at our report.
Any other questions? Secretary Domingo, in his comments today, talking about the agenda for the meeting tomorrow and on Sunday, he spoke about SMEs, about small and medium enterprises, about micro enterprises. Dr. Hu, could you talk about smaller firms and why is there this attention on micro, small, and medium enterprises? How does that relate to trade and growth, and what can that mean for people on the ground at a grassroots level?
Okay, we've done a separate study on SMEs, and I think what we find, of course, as many of you would know, it's a major source of employment creation for the economies, and its share of the local economy is quite significant, some as much as 90%. And certainly in the APEC region, we find that out of those small and medium enterprises, quite a overwhelming large majority of them are actually micro enterprises, so even smaller, some as much as 70% of total small medium enterprises. So tomorrow there'll be a lot of discussions by the trade ministers in forming some sort of action agenda to support SMEs, in particular to help them to globalize, to get them access to international markets, and as well as to see what needs to be done to support these SMEs. It's not just done at the trade level, but you will also have in the finance ministers process in APEC a lot of discussions this year in terms of some of the challenges for SMEs in getting access to capital. So a lot of that will be discussed as part of that action agenda.
Question? Anyone have a question? Okay, well, I'll ask one final question, and that is, tomorrow is the ministers responsible for trade meeting. So focusing on the issue of trade, what are some of the key challenges that you see looking ahead in the area of trade and trade growth? Okay.
Well, I think if you see from my first chart, you can see that growth is, although optimistic, is a little uncertain for the region over the next few years because of a lot of these external uncertainties. And that, of course, would have an impact on trade as well. And as you can see from the chart, although trade growth is quite robust, concerns of economic outlook would perhaps raise some issues about rising trade protectionism, for example, as one of the ways of trying to protect certain economies from these uncertainties. And that's the wrong solution. And I think tomorrow many of the trade ministers will continue to discuss the issue of challenging and addressing the rise in trade barriers and to basically stop them in their tracks if possible. And some of these things will be discussed on those issues.
Okay. Oh, we have a question. Please.
Sir, good afternoon. My name is Cliff Benzon from Nikkei, the Japanese business newspaper. Um, some observers say that China's massive reclamation in the South China Sea could threaten freedom of navigation vis-a-vis security and trade. What are your thoughts on that? Thank you.
I think for what we can say is that within APEC, that this is a meeting where we'll be focusing on trade and economic issues. It is not a forum for addressing strategic issues, military security issues. And that will be the focus of ministers tomorrow and on Sunday. Dr. I don't know if you'd like to talk about risks generally in the region.
Well, of course, David is right. This is not the forum for this kind of discussions. Much of it's what we discuss is on trade and economic issues. But that said, though, of course, global outlook, economic outlook, as well as for the region, for APEC, would of course, besides the concerns of oil prices, commodity movements of commodity prices, would also have some concerns on the geopolitical situation in the region, of course.
Any final questions? Last chance. Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Hugh. Thank you to all of you. The APEC Economic Trends Analysis Report is available or will be available on the APEC website, which is www.apec.org, apec.org. And you can check it out. There's lots of material there to help you navigate the meetings coming up tomorrow and on Sunday, and to get a better sense of what the key agenda items are. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.